My name is Jesse from the Warehouse Podcast. Before we get into this episode, I did want to apologize for the various technical issues that we experienced during the recording of this episode. I did my best to edit the video and audio, but some of what was said was lost in this process. The vast majority of the technical problems came when Tyler was speaking, despite Eli being the one in the process of prepping for an impending hurricane. As you listen to the episode or watch on YouTube, you might notice some of these problems. We apologize for the technical difficulties in advance and will work to resolve them in the future. With that said, thank you so much for listening and enjoy the episode.
Welcome back to the Warehouse Podcast. I'm Tyler.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Eli.
And yes, all three of us are back together again is it the first time since like the beginning of the season that we've been
Yeah,
talking?
since before the season.
I think we made
100%.
we made some false promises that we were going to do that like once a month. That just did not happen, did it?
No.
No.
It didn't.
But
I think we did some good things though. In
yeah.
in the absence of the joint group.
Yeah, we did something a little different this year with the format. We did a lot more episodes, shorter episodes, just one of us. I mean, tell us, if you're listening, tell us how you felt about the format and we'll take that into consideration. But we are back to discuss the unfortunate end of the Baltimore Orioles season. I know he did cap of game two, commiserations and the funeral that was that episode. We're going to get a little bit more deeper into, I guess, the season as a whole, how we're feeling about it, what went wrong, and kind of go from there. And it's going to be a little bit more of a freewheeling episode. We don't have a very formal outline. I'll be nice and say it's not a very formal outline. But we're going to get into some stuff and how we're feeling moving forward about the Baltimore Orioles. But before we do that, let's go to our ad sponsor for this week's episode.
BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football. BetOnline is every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads to bet on during the games. Think you know your stuff? Get in on our $200,000 mega contest and pick 5 games against the spread every week for your chance at weekly prizes and a share of $200,000. When the game's over, head on over to our online casino to get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of our over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Bet online, the game starts here.
So that is our sponsor, and now we're going to move on to the content of the episode. Natural segues, as always. So I think the top line question for this episode, guys, is just what went wrong. Because I put this question out there: was the Orioles season a failure in your perspective? Obviously, they made the playoffs. That's positive, but I think we had a little bit higher aspirations. So, Jess, what do you think? Was this season a failure for the Baltimore Orioles?
Absolutely. I don't think there's a way to conceptualize the season as anything basically other than a failure. Now, granted, like the team did make the playoffs, and we do have to have some, we can't take that for granted, right? But we do have to look at it in context. This was a team that won 101 games last year. This is a team that was looking to win the World Series. And not only, I mean, I mentioned this in my game two recap, we took a giant step backward in terms of our regular season wins. And we took I mean, the most charitable interpretation is that we made zero progress moving forward. But as you mentioned before the show, Tyler, I think it's arguable that we took a step backwards, even in the postseason. So even though it was 0 wins in both postseasons, this playoff performance, uh, it seemed like the Orioles came in equally as unprepared, equally as not ready to compete in the postseason as we were last year. And yeah, so I think if you're looking at this season overall, this was a season that the Orioles went out to go get Corbin Burns to win the World Series. And it's doubtful that he'll be back with us. So obviously, it's a team game. It doesn't revolve around one player, but that was the move the Orioles were making with the intent to win the World Series. And I would have been satisfied if we had even progressed, if we had won one playoff series and then lost to the Yankees, for instance, or we had won one or two playoff series and got kicked out. In that situation, I would have conceptualized it as a step forward. But right now, in both realms, postseason and regular season, definitely a big step backward. And I think the Orioles have a lot of questions to answer this offseason and moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think the playoff performance changes a lot of the perception of the season as a whole. But Eli, I'll let you give your thoughts on if it was a failure or not.
Yeah, I think that the season was a failure. I will say that I think I don't know. I'm not quite sure that I put as much stock in the postseason performance. Like clearly the team went to sleep. Clearly it did not perform when it mattered. Um, but like as to what that says about the state of the organization as a whole, I don't put a whole bunch of stock in that. Um, because it is just two games, and so you don't have much of an opportunity to gain a ton of information about anything from just that two-game sample. Um, besides saying Corbin Burns is really good.
Yeah.
Um, but we do have this like much, much larger sample of the regular season, and a lot of what we saw there was also not promising. Very large and tangible step back from Adley, I think is maybe in the long term the most concerning thing. Um, we obviously are going to go into next year with a pretty depleted rotation. I think we're coming in with probably Grayson, Kramer, Trevor Rogers, Povich, and McDermott is probably the top
Eflin.
five, right?
Yeah,
Oh,
Eflin will
Eflin,
be back.
jeez. Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you, thank you. Um, whew. Yeah, I was like thinking through that. And I'm like, this is really bad. So, Eflin makes
We
that much better.
yeah, yeah.
But like we saw, four or five of those guys can get wiped out at any time. And so the pitching depth from maybe an upside and a just depth standpoint is definitely concerning. Um, and yeah, we are losing Corbin Burns. We're losing, theoretically Santander, who was such an integral part of the lineup this year, and in holding together, you know, a team that was really trying to fall apart at the end. Um, so it definitely does not really bode well. I think it shows the the youngness of the team. Like there is like very early on, I think Colton Cowser jumped out to be a pretty important part of our lineup, and somebody like him is in his first full season. Clearly had a weakness against off-speed pitches against changeups that was exploited to the fullest extent toward the end of the season. It was all that he was thrown. um, and
Hmm.
something like that, losing a member as important as he was for an extended period of time, and he's also like trying to just play out his first season to stay healthy, do all these things that big leaguers do throughout the course of a year. Um, I think that happened to him. We saw like Adley had collapsed around the same time. We had injuries, we had all sorts of things falling apart, and Gunnar Henderson cannot do it all himself.
Yeah.
So that was a long spiel, but just to say, yeah, I think we saw a lot of concerning stuff, and I think you have to come out of this season feeling like we took a step back, or at least failed to take an anticipated step forward.
Yeah, because I think like you're kind of you mentioned the playoffs and not being too swayed there because I think the playoffs in the current format, as Jesse talked about this before the podcast, it's a little bit of a crapshoot given the shorter series. So like you can have situations where the good team doesn't progress because it's just a shorter series, anything can happen, yada yada yada. But I think what we did see in the shorter series was sort of a continuation of what the last month or two of the Orioles season was, which was the pitching kind of figured it out, like against all odds with Bradish. Arguably Bradish is better than Burns. You can make that argument, but as good as Burns, he was gone. Means was gone. Wells was gone. You didn't have your all-world closer. Craig Kimbrell imploded, and despite all of that, the pitching kind of figured stuff out towards the end of the season. They were good in the two-game series against the Royals, but it was the offense which what we've been told for years and years and years was basically we're going to grow the bats. We're going to have the best hitting system in the world. Our guys are going to come up. They're going to produce all these runs, and sure, we're going to need to trade for pitching. We'll do that when the time comes, but offense is not going to be a problem for the Baltimore Orioles. And that was true for the first 2.5 months of the season. And then it absolutely was not true for the last 3.5 months, plus the one playoff series. And it was just like a stubbornness again and again, like they're gonna figure it out. They're gonna figure it out. And just time and time again, that was not happening. It was never, let's reinvent ourselves a little bit. Let's try and play for a run or two here versus just hoping somebody hits the ball over the fence. Just that was a little bit for me concerning to see that. Not that the front office can do so much after July 30th or July 31st or whatever the deadline was this year, but that the day-to-day management of the games wasn't changing. And then in the playoffs, where it's just a different game in the playoffs. Like, yes, occasionally you have a blowout in the playoffs, but a lot of times they're very close games. They tend to be lower scoring. And although the Texas Rangers run last year was a little bit of an outlier where they were kind of bashing teams left, right, and center, most years it's these, 3-2 games, even 5-4 is relatively low scoring. The Orioles were like never interested in playing that kind of game. They wanted to win a game 7-2. And that was frustrating for me. And I hope that that was a learning experience moving forward. It's a little bit more multi-dimensional than what the 2024 Baltimore Orioles were. Because as you said, Eli, guys go into slumps, Rutschman disappears. You can't, that your whole offense can evaporate because a couple guys are not working. You need to find out how to do a few more things. And it ultimately became like the Gunnar Henderson show in the second half, where if Gunnar didn't have a good day, they weren't going to score more than 2 or 3 runs. And you just needed the pitching to be fantastic. And ironically enough, it was pretty darn good thanks to a miracle run from Albert Suarez and Dean Kramer figuring it. Yeah, I mean, it's a failure in that regard when that's how the team was supposed to be built, and that ultimately failed us when we really needed it most, and that was quite disappointing.
Yeah,
I,
sorry, just one quick thing. What's really amazing about this conversation is we say, the offense failed, the offense failed, the offense failed. And, this is a team that over the course of the year by WRC plus was 15% better than league average. So like I haven't done the seasonal split admittedly, but that was good for third in the game, and that's right behind the Dodgers in New York and ahead of Arizona, Houston, San Diego, the Mets. It's like all of these phenomenal teams, like the offense clearly has it in them. And that was part of what was so just wildly frustrating about it, and part of what tells me that it is, partially the growing pains of some of these young guys, even Adley. Like, since he had come up, really, this was the first extended slump that he had had, since his first couple months in the big leagues. And so, and people tied that to like a hit by pitch on the hand and all sorts of other stuff. But whatever it was, he was unable to truly like right the ship, and Cowser was unable to right the ship. And I think that's the kind of that resiliency is the thing that seemed like it was missing this year. Is just once we were down, we failed to make adjustments, failed to start, attacking balls the way we did in the first half. Um, yeah, yeah,
I also did just want to say that yes, it is true. Just sort of responding to your initial comments, Eli. Like, I do understand and acknowledge that the playoffs is just two games. At least in this case for the Orioles. And while that is true, that it is sort of there is randomness to what happens to the Orioles during that time. You know, the fact is that the Orioles do need to learn how to play, compete, and win in the playoffs. So even though, uh, you know, yeah, even though maybe it's not exactly fair, or you say it's a small sample size and you can't, that's not reflective of the entire team, or whatever arguments you want to make about it, ultimately it is a team that needs to learn how to win in the playoffs and also like gain experience in the playoffs, right? That's another, I think, critical component of it is that the Orioles just had two playoff games, right? And the more playoff games you're able to play, the more routine it feels, the more natural it feels. And those things are really, really important. So, that's why, even though yes it is random and all these sorts of things, it is still there was an opportunity for the Orioles to develop this playoff ability, which, as Tyler said, is just a different game. And we didn't really develop that. And we're going to go into the playoffs next year almost equally as unprepared as we entered this playoffs. So,
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing to me is like, the question is like, did we did we come into a situation where we were up against this like overwhelming pressure and, nebulous thing of quote unquote the playoffs? Or did we come up and just happen to face like Cole Reagans and Seth Lugo, who were like top five in pitcher war throughout the year? And, and like the Royals bullpen was very, very good by the end of the year. Um, Clearly they handled us extremely well. Lucas Erceg was dominant. There's this question of did we just, you know, did we run into like an insurmountable, like immovable wall? Did we run into this thing that we were not able to handle, regardless of the context around it? And, I think that the Royals and their pitching staff were good enough to hold any team in baseball to this one run over two games. That is a possibility with them all the time. Um, and that's largely how they got through the end of the year. Not to say that they're like the greatest thing since sliced bread, but they are like those two pitchers in particular are very, very talented. Um, and there is a chance that that's just if you play those games 75 times, yes, we win a number of them, and that's great. But in that situation, one run can tip it either way. Um, so I guess I just say that to say that's when I say small sample size. It's like, are we going to say, oh, all of these hitters had the right or like the wrong mindset coming into this, and they need to change the way they hit the ball, and we need to switch up, everything about their approaches? Or is it like, well, Cole Reagans is just nasty, um,
Yeah, I think that
it's
maybe
difficult.
I think that's potentially a way to view game one of the series. Reagan's was very good, and there wasn't a ton of wiggle room. I think I did the recap episode. There were a couple opportunities where I think they could have managed the situations a little bit differently. Maybe you squeeze out a runner here, run or two here or there, and you win the game. But there's less. There's less there. Game two, where they've got the bases loaded with no outs and they don't score at all. That's an
Sure,
insane situation
sure,
where you are basically like not guaranteed, but you should score twice in that
right.
situation. At least. Um, of course, there's individual situations where that doesn't happen, but when we see Cowser get hit in the middle of his body it's like that's like okay, we need to rethink this a little bit. But of course, no, you're not going to blow up the team, and I don't think any of us are going to advocate for that. I do think to Jesse's point about needing experience and all that stuff, obviously you can't a person can't get experience without doing the thing, but the Orioles can certainly infuse some experience externally, which I think feels like a gap in this team on the offensive side of things. Like, yes, they went and got Eloy Jimenez at the deadline, a weird move that looks even weirder in retrospect. I'm not thinking his option is going to get picked up for $16 million or something, whatever that is. But there are going to be players on the free agent market that I think the Orioles could take a look at. Of course, that's going to require them to likely make some changes internally, which could mean trading some players that they have that might be liked, that we have on the roster right now. And that's just some of these are some things that I think we're at a point where this season was not World Series or bust, and I'm not so sure I would say 2025 is World Series or bust, but it is like progress in the playoffs or bust. Like you need to be better in the playoffs in 2025 than you were this year. Beyond 2025 is when you get to the point where a lot of these homegrown guys are going to get more expensive. You're going to start having to think about some things a little bit differently. Maybe Henderson gets an extension this offseason and that sorts out some things. But yeah, I think you go into 2025 with a very clear goal of like, look, we don't got to win the whole thing, but we got to show that we are progressing as an organization. We're not just the team that hoarded prospects for 3 years, didn't really trade them for anybody, and we flame out in the wild card round of the division series every single year. Um, Now, as to who we target there, I'm open to suggest. I've got positions in mind, but yeah, I do think I agree with Jesse. If that's what you're saying is experience is needed, I do think they could use and some additional talent to maybe bring that experience on board and just have like a veteran in the lineup that you can look at and be like, everything's gonna be okay. We got this guy and he's been here before. He can do it, and if he can do it, we all can do it. Because that's like only Mullins is the only one in the lineup that felt like he had a grasp on the situation in these wild card games. He didn't seem like the moment was too big for him. Everybody else, it was like they were whittling the bat down to a toothpick by the time they got in the batter's box. And we can't have that next year. Um, so yeah, that's my thought there.
Yeah, no arguments.
Um, what else do we want to talk about? I know we talked about the young guy. I mean, are we worried about the young guys at all? Rutschman really struggled. Eli, you mentioned how you're not so sure it's an injury related thing. Kauser had his issues with breaking balls and off speed stuff. Um, those are the kind of the two bigger ones. Obviously, then there's Mayo and Holiday who didn't get as much of a chance but really struggled. So Eli, what are you thinking about sort of the young pipeline of players that I think we've been told is going to be strong and we're not going to do this rebuild again, but they didn't exactly instill confidence the whole season the way I think maybe we hoped they would.
Yeah, to me, I mean, I'm not so worried about Kauser and Rutschman is the first thing I'll say. Like, I have full faith and confidence. It's difficult to make adjustments in season, and whatever the cause was for Adley, like, I feel like he is just a unique enough athlete to have good awareness of what his body is doing to adjust to pitches. Like, um, so I think he will be able to make those adjustments as a whole. Whatever this was that sent him into this spiral, I think it's a unique thing. With Kauser, that's part of like growing in this league. People always talk about a sophomore slump. This was somewhat that. We had part of a season last year. This was like the league adjusting to him, exposing a weakness. He will go in the lab and he'll figure it out. The other two, on the other hand, I think this kind of speaks to this larger problem that the Orioles have because we are so reliant on that young homegrown talent. We are putting ourselves in positions where we rely on them for performance. Um, and like the progression of a young player is not, this gradual slope up, like we just saw with Kauser. He had this phenomenal start to the season. An adjustment was made to him. He failed to make it back. He slumped at the end of the year. With Holiday and with Mayo, it's going to be the same thing. Pitchers were able to just get one over on them. I think basically just by virtue of those two guys never having seen Major League pitching. But once they get up, they start seeing Major League pitching, get an extended run at the beginning of next year. And then, like, their strengths start to settle out and pitchers start to make adjustments to that. We're going to go through another little downturn. And there's going to be this really um, up and down season, I guess is the point. That's what happens with these guys. Even Gunner's first few months were not ideal. When he first came up in 22 and then the first couple months of last year. And so I guess to stop talking about the individuals and get to the larger point, like I am hesitant to put ourselves in a position where we trade Ryan Mountcastle, for example, and Kobe Mayo is the right-handed first baseman,
Mhm.
because I think that's not good enough for a team that really is trying to get to the playoffs next year. I have full faith and confidence that Kobe Mayo is going to hit 30, 35 home runs year in and year out for a long time in this league. But the fact of the matter is he's not going to do it next year. And we put ourselves in this position where you have to play these games with these prospects to try to get them in, get them some time, but also not just hurt the team so terribly. Um, and that's a really difficult line to walk. And I do have confidence, but I think that at its root is maybe the biggest thing that the Orioles need to figure out is how do we keep this manner of consistency throughout the year? How do we make these adjustments more quickly? And I think that stems, back from we all talk about the Orioles train these swing decisions, they train this approach, and that's what develops these hitters in this particular way. But I think your approach needs to be a little bit more fluid at the big league level. There is more of a cat and mouse game with the pitcher in front of you because they are so wildly good. Um, and ultimately, the pitcher is the one who starts every single pitch. They are the ones in command of the situation. Um, so, I think that is probably the biggest thing the Orioles need to look at is how do we teach resilience and this kind of like fluidity of approach into these guys to meet the situation in front of them while simultaneously continuing to play to their strengths. It's certainly not an easy thing, and I'm not claiming I know how to do
Yeah.
it, but um, if we are going to just rely on Holiday and Mayo in the lineup next year, we're likely going to run into these same shortcomings, I think.
Well, it is, the Orioles run on young position players has been really impressive. I mean, you can't say they haven't hit on really any of the big names. Rutschman has been fantastic up until the last 2 months of this season. Henderson, obviously, Cowser had his struggles, but still a really good player. And then Joey Ortiz traded to Milwaukee, but was really good for Milwaukee. And, we're kind of, I think the first player that hasn't really hit their expectations, it's had a longer chance is Kerstad. But, he hasn't really had a consistency. So, like, the Orioles have had a really good run, but I think, like, in my brain, it's like they can't all click, right? You got to kind of make your choices here and there, and you got to make trades. And the Orioles really haven't done that. They really only traded Joey Ortiz because they had so many shortstops. They had Westberg and Henderson and Holiday, and I can't, as Ortiz was this year, I can't say that they made a poor decision. Henderson and Westberg are arguably better than Joey Ortiz. So is that a bad decision? I don't know, but you do start to think like you can't keep them all. The Orioles have really kept them all, and you know that could be a big question this offseason is do you make a trade or do you try to see it through to its end conclusion? I don't know that I know the answer to that yet, but it just the Orioles are going against the grain with keeping all these young guys for as long as they have. But yeah, I don't know, Jess. Do you have anything to chime in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we can look at next year, I think that's going to be really important is the addition of Mateo returning, and especially helping Holiday sort of not necessarily be playing every single day at second base. So I think he could be important or an important piece for the Orioles moving forward. I do think that yeah, the Orioles have to find a way. I mean, we look at even someone like Westberg, and it's not even clear necessarily that Westberg, I think, is in the clear, and that the other pitchers around the league aren't going to find some sort of weakness to try to exploit next year. So, I mean, I think we are definitely in dangerous territory when we have three starting infielders being under the age of, 23 or 25 or whatever, right? So I think the problem with how the Orioles are set up is they're not really in a position to go get or to go give a long contract to somebody to play the middle infield. They would need somebody, the middle infield or corner infield. They would need somebody for maybe 1 or 2 years. Someone like a Mountcastle that can split time or somebody like this, right? Or, at the other positions, it varies a little bit. So trying to find a way to inject, this more veteran presence in the infield, I think what you both are saying is going to be a tough task, but I think Urias and Mateo coming back next year, hopefully will help to balance things out a little bit. Um, and then, yeah, having the option if these guys do struggle to send them back down. If Mayo doesn't perform next year, he doesn't have to stay on the major league roster the whole year. So that, of course, will allow some flexibility. But yeah, I think it is a problem being so dependent upon all these young players to perform and to not only perform but really carry the team in a way, which is really too much of a burden to ask for, I think.
Well, yeah, and you talk about adding a veteran presence, and it's been popular for I think Oriole fans to look at the end of Elias's time in Houston as a guide to what he would do in Baltimore. Carlos Beltran as a veteran for a pretty, like a 1 year deal, I think, for pretty big money. And Beltran, you go look at his stats that last year with Houston. He was not particularly productive, but the Astros did win the World Series, and of course, there's a cloud that hangs over that era of Houston Astros
Tyler,
baseball.
what
And
did
Beltran,
Carlos Beltran bring?
look, there might have been some trash can receptacles, a system, but also a veteran presence that knew how to steal signs and systematically relay them to the hitters, but also some experience. Obviously, I'm not advocating for cheating with the Baltimore Orioles, but I am advocating for something similar of an older player that knows how to get the job done, whatever that job may be, and whatever is required to win baseball games. And I think if you're talking about the infield, obviously the only position to me that makes sense is going to be first base. Because I don't think I consider Mountcastle or O'Hearn exemplary players. I think they both do a nice job and they combine to be a fairly productive first base, but there's certainly a power issue, I think, at first base the Orioles have. Mountcastle, obviously a right-handed hitter, is not kind to right-handed hitters. And then O'Hearn, just not a ton of power for I think he looks like a guy that would give you a lot more power. It just isn't really there. So I think that's a position I would look at potentially for a veteran. Now, you know, are you necessarily going to get more production out of that player than those two? I don't know, but maybe you get one player instead of two players to get a portion of the contribution, and then you can reallocate that additional position elsewhere and put somebody else on that spot in the roster. I'm not so sure. I know I've looked at a couple options. Like Paul Goldschmidt's an interesting name. Didn't have a very good year this year, but it sounds like the Cardinals are obviously experienced, obviously, has done some great things in his career. That could be an interesting option. But yeah, if I'm looking at any position right now, I would think first base could be the area where you could potentially take a flyer on somebody and maybe you get an upgrade. But it's certainly not an easy thing to sort out. That's for sure.
First base is a tough position to platoon, so
Yeah, which is what the Orioles have done. And O'Hearn, I O'Hearn really just is a hitter. I think anytime he's
Right.
in the field anywhere, I'm concerned. Uh, and that's a tough spot for him to be as well, is only a hitter, uh, really a thing in the modern day of baseball. So I don't know. That's kind of what I'm thinking right now because I want them to have a veteran hitter in the lineup that maybe he's not going to be the most exciting. I think we've talked in our text chain about Carlos Santana as an option. Definitely would boost the on base percentage, that's for sure. Um,
I
but
saw that
but
he mashed lefties last year as well,
love that.
which was nice. But
And he's a
yeah,
switch hitter, right? So
he is a switch hitter.
there you go.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that in my eyes, I think that we are particularly like I think O'Hearn did very well. It like tapered off toward the end of the year, but he had
Mhm.
a largely pretty steady season. And at the beginning of the year, just in quality of contact, he was top five in the majors for just like xWOBA and certain figures like that. So there is a lot of promise with him, and it's an $8 million option. It's really not a whole lot relatively. I
Mhm.
think once you look at you're investing, that 8 million plus the anticipated, I think it's like 6.6 or whatever on MLBTR, that they're expecting Mountcastle to make an arbitration. Then it's kind of weird to have 14 million across two roster spots and
Yeah.
only kind of have one player out of that. The fact that neither of them can really do anything else in any sort of trustworthy way is problematic. Yeah. Um, but to me, like I think that Mountcastle will he will still fetch something on the open market because he has had really high highs. I guess I open market, I mean trade market.
Yeah.
And I think that in particular, this team needs a right-handed bat. Um, I still look at it and I look at us coming into next year and the highlights of our team, not including Santander, of course, are going to be Gunnar, Adley, Cowser, um, and Mullins if he is the end of year version of himself. I think that you look at that stuff and it's like, okay, Jordan Westberg is going to look good. And then we need, I think, another righty to balance that out. Um,
Hmm.
so I think that's the biggest thing for me. Um, like obviously you're going to be relatively happy with a Gunnar Westberg Adley, 1, 2, 3, or if you want to swap Adley and Westberg, whatever. Um, but yeah, just somebody to come in and mash lefties, and it feels like a need. It feels like we have these guys who will come and lean on right-handed pitching, and you can put up 8 runs against a right-handed pitcher, and you cannot really do the same thing against lefties. Um,
Hmm.
and losing Santander um, as another switch hitting option, I think hurts that even more. Theoretically, if you replace him with Kerstad in the outfield, then this lineup looks even more slanted in
Yeah.
favor of left-handed hitters. So that's where I look. There is like to cover what you said, and maybe a right-handed hitting platoon option in the outfield. There's maybe like a Mark Canna also,
Hmm.
um, and he hits lefties pretty well too. Um, I don't know though. Yeah, it's not easy, and really like what it is this offense and this roster doesn't have an explicit weakness, and so what you're looking for is what is the position that we can like push forward to really push the team over the top. Um, and again, this was a team that was third in the major leagues in WRC plus. The offense was extremely good. And so you could argue that there's just not really much to do, run it back and just try to keep it steady this year. But you will not have 44 home runs out of Anthony Santander probably, um, even if we
Yeah.
do re-sign him. So there is some production being lost, I think. And then there is also, you got to like maybe even spice it up. Not to say we're like getting tired of this core, but at the same time, like finding a way to, yeah, glue the team together in a new and sort of refreshing way, I think would be beneficial.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, you're not going to blow the team up. It's as you said, it is productive. It's just it's a weighted production towards the first half of the season where they were really
Yeah.
fantastic and it just wasn't quite there the same way. And it wasn't just like that's the thing. It wasn't just one player. Like Gunner was incredible in the first. Was still very good in the second half, just not as incredible. Mullins was bad in the first half, good in everybody else like just regressed a little bit. Um, but no, there's a lot of good stuff there, and I think there's also reason to believe that guys are ascending. But yeah, there's something missing that they've got to tweak there. So I feel like we're all kind of aligned there. Maybe not exactly on the specific solution, but at least what the problem is. So that's something. And I feel like we haven't even talked about the pitching yet. I know Eli, you mentioned at the top what the rotation is going to look like next year without Burns, but that's kind of the other question for me is like, what do they do there? I think we know Bradish. Well, we don't know. We assume Bradish will be back late next year. The bullpen feels okay right now. Bautista will be back as your closer, which is awesome. But the rotation is, as I feel like it has been for every year until this one, an arm light. And there are going to be options out there. Blake Snell is a free agent, and he was pretty good after a rough start. Jesse, how do you feel about the state of the rotation, and if you think anything needs to be done?
Well, yeah, I mean, the big question, I mean, I think we should have enough depth to hopefully make it through. Of course, if we have a season with injuries like this year, even that's in severe question. But overall, yeah, it's about who the ace is going to be. If we make the playoffs again, who's going out there for game one? who's doing what Corbin Burns did in the playoffs for us and giving us seven shutout innings or eight shutout innings or seven or eight with one run. What kind of performance is gonna who's gonna do that for us, right? And we had hoped at one point in time that Bradish, that Grayson Rodriguez, I remember you both talking about hoping that these both of these guys graduate to become the ace after Corbin Burns leaves. And that is a serious, serious question and sort of a doubt at this point whether either of them would be able to fulfill the number one role, particularly this upcoming season. So I don't know what the Orioles do. I think they're going to end up, I don't think they're going to try to go get an ace for 1 year. I don't think they're going to do another Corbin Burns like rental situation like they did this year. I think they're probably going to try to hope that Bradish or Grayson becomes that ace. And I think they're going to try to like emphasize the depth component rather than the front of the rotation component. And I think they're going to go hard for that. So whether that strategy will work, I don't know. I think it's a perilous one a little bit especially when you start talking about the postseason. I think that's a strategy that could work to get us to the postseason, sort of amping or sort of relying upon and bolstering depth in the organization for rotation arms. But in terms of having a solid ace, having a Tariq Skubal, I can definitely see the Orioles going this upcoming season without a guy like that. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think we can definitely say Scooball's off the table at this point. Tiger figured something out there, and I don't think they're going to change tack too much this offseason. I guess the other big name that was at the deadline that didn't get moved was Crochet, and he will have an additional year of team control. So I guess that could be an avenue, but certainly not as like safe, I think, as the Scooball move would be. I think there's a track record of Scooball being really good. Crochet, it's really just 1 year, and it was the second half for him was not as dominant as the first half was. So maybe there's something there, but Eli, what do you think about the situation?
Yeah, I agree that the Orioles are not going to go all in for an ace. I don't think I view it like quite as dire as Jesse does. I think that, assuming Bradish comes back healthy at the end of the year, even if he is not like, the 2.7 ERA or whatever version of himself from last year, he's going to be a wildly effective pitcher, capable of getting a strikeout. I think that Grayson is very good. I think that Eflin is very good. Um, and Eflin is probably even more stable than Grayson. And I think running those three out there as your playoff rotation, you're in pretty good shape largely. I think that looks a lot like what we were hoping to see this year if Grayson had made the playoffs, made the playoff rotation. So
Yeah.
I think that largely that's not too much of a change. I think that Bradish, what he showed in 2023 was every bit as good as what Burns showed us this year, I think. He is truly like an elite tier pitcher when he's on. And I like it's hard to trust that, of course, and obviously we will not have that throughout the entire season next year, but at the same time, he is coming. And so yeah, I don't necessarily expect the Orioles to go ahead and do something like that. In my eyes, what's more concerning is that as we're currently shaped up with Eflin, Grayson, Kramer, Trevor Rogers, and Povit, yeah, Povich and McDermott. I just mixed their names into one thing. Povich and McDermott kind of holding down that fifth spot. I think that's what really concerns me. Um, and I think you definitely need to add somebody else in that, is an established veteran. I don't think you have to go to the top of the market, but quickly to me, what my mind looks at is maybe even like a Walker Bueller who had a really down year and is
Mhm.
probably looking for some kind of 1 year, like established value contract. And you throw $10, $12 million at him and you can probably bring him in. And then it's a little bit of an upside play, and at the same time, you're getting just an established pitcher. His floor is probably what he did this year, which is, an ERA in the fours. Um,
Hmm.
and something like that, I think kind of playing toward the back end of the rotation is totally fine in this situation because um, we have a semi-solid front of the rotation between Eflin and Grayson to lead us through the year. Kramer made some improvements this year, his new splitter and everything. Theoretically, that can keep progressing. I think that, what we largely know what we have. I am also putting a lot of stock in Trevor Rogers. I expect him to come back much better than he was this year. I think that the Orioles having a full offseason to work with him would be great. But, theoretically, you could invest in somebody else to help share the load there as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I will say like Povich, we haven't really talked about him. Povich was really good in September.
Hmm.
Um, I'm looking at his numbers here. 2.60 ERA across 5 starts, 162 batting average against, 224 on base percentage against, 333 slugging. Um, just was really good. He figured and like I will say even earlier in the season he had moments where he really shined and then he had the Oakland Athletics start. But Povich I'm encouraged by. So I'm kind of excited to see what he looks like after getting that rookie experience out of the way. You learn from it, you have the growing pains, and now you can go from there. So I'm excited about Povich, but I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, and it kind of jives with Mike Elias's whole team building philosophy of not overextending yourself for the moment. I think he saw the Corbin Burns trade as a really good value opportunity. I think that you can't really criticize it at all because yes, Ortiz has been good for the Brewers, 5 in the Cy Young voting, and it really is a trade that worked out for both sides. And depth on the pitching staff is what saved us this season. So I do expect there to be some investment there. I like the Walker Bueller shout. That's a good option there. And it's nice to have the Orioles be a destination for that kind of a thing now, where it's a player that actually legitimately feels like they could bounce back and have a career versus Matt Harvey just seeing an opportunity to get one last paycheck and
Yeah, I
shovel
was
some crap innings.
I was scrolling through the list and I did see Jordan Lyles is available. So
Oh, hey, sign
yeah,
him up.
if anyone's interested.
The Royals had him, right? Did they have him this year or was that
Yeah,
last year?
no, they had him this year and they let go of him.
So, I mean, look, they beat us.
It was a 2-year contract, yeah.
Kyle
But
Gibson is out there. He had an okay year, I think, for the Cardinals.
I am also seeing Shane Bieber is out there too. He's obviously coming off of Tommy John, but
Yeah.
presumably he would have some workouts with the team before he signed. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. These are fun options.
Kind of rebound candidates?
Yeah. I don't know that I love a guy coming off Tommy John when we have another guy coming. Well, we have two guys coming off Tommy John with Bautista and Bradish.
Yeah,
And
that's fair.
what John means, not that he's going to pitch this year. We know that's not happening, but
No, John
maybe
Means is a free agent.
I know, but go get him for
Bring him
2026,
back?
right?
Oh, okay, my
Yeah.
bad.
We're good. That's next. That's an episode a year from now. We don't have to
Right,
talk about that
right.
now. Okay, well, I feel like we covered a lot of our stuff. The Orioles aren't going to tear things down this offseason. There's a good core there still, but yeah, this season was a disappointment, and there's no really other way to slice it and dice it. Jesse did remind me that Brandon Hyde is coming back next season. I guess that was kind of a question that I know I mentioned in my game one recap about some questionable decisions, in-game decisions. And Mike Elias addressed it immediately after the season, saying that Brandon Hyde is coming back next year. They did not really talk about any of the other coaches, but Brandon Hyde is coming back. Feel that that was the correct decision to bring Brandon Hyde back for 2025.
I'm cool with it. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's largely, I don't know, this the same stuff we've been saying about you don't need to blow it all up. This is clearly a recipe that is giving some success. Um, I like, yeah, I also, you two did the recaps of the playoff games, but I thought that pitching to Bobby Witt in the second game was just, I don't know, I thought it was outlandish and did not make any sense. You walk him, and then Cionel Perez is matched up against the lefty and Vinny Pasquantino. Yennier Cano is not a strikeout pitcher at all, which is pretty much, what you need. You don't want a guy to put the ball in play in that situation, and Bobby Witt has some of the best contact skills in the game. So, I'm not one to harp on managerial decisions because there are other considerations that I am undoubtedly not aware of in these situations. But I like in that one, I was like, all right, come on.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I mean, on the broader scale, yeah, I don't think that Brandon Hyde, made the difference in this series. It was that the Orioles couldn't hit. And,
Yeah.
retaliating and firing the manager right away, I think gives a gives an impression to the team that the front office does not have confidence that this is as stable you know, as it looks like from the outside. It's like, you know, from the outside, everyone sees this team and it's like, okay, the Orioles are this young team. They are like at the beginning of this large open window. And if you say, okay, well, that didn't work, go fire the manager, let's figure out something new, we got to reroute, that seems like you're backtracking and, you're on the defensive a little bit. And that's probably not the image you want to project either to those young players or externally. Um, and I think that, Brandon Hyde is certainly good enough. He has led this team to 192 wins in 2 seasons, an average of 96 a year. So it's hardly like an argument that what he's doing is bringing the team down.
Mhm.
There might not be another team in the American League who's done that over the last 2 seasons. So
Yeah, and I mean, that is one good note. Like I think I mentioned it in an episode a few weeks ago. Is like in our lifetime, the three of us, the Orioles really haven't made the playoffs in back-to-back seasons. They did when we were
right,
like little kids. And I know I just cut out there because you guys froze for me. Hopefully the audio is
okay,
all good. We have no idea. This is a complete crapshoot of an episode. We haven't done it together in 6 months, and of course it's gonna be a disaster. But um anyway, Jesse, I'm just gonna go to you for your Brandon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So definitely. So I agree. I mean, I'm similarly I'm fine with the decision, and I hear your point, Eli, that firing Hyde would have seemed like an overreaction, perhaps, from the organization. With that said, I will say that I think next year, if the Orioles get swept in the first season, I'm sorry, in the first series of the playoffs, I think that at that point, yeah, things will have to change. The window is not infinite that the Orioles have, and I think next year the Orioles really have to see significant improvements in the right direction. I think that the struggles, especially at the second half of this year, you can chalk a lot of that up to the injuries. And, you could sort of give Brandon Hyde a little bit of a pass for a lot of what's happened over the course of the year and the struggles in the second half. And I will say I do think I am a little harsher on both of you about Brandon Hyde in the playoffs. I mean, I do think yes, obviously the offense was the biggest problem, but especially in these 1-2 run or in these 1 run games, some different Brandon Hyde decisions at critical moments could have, I think, had significant impacts on the series. So yeah, so I do think that he did not have a good series managerially. I think he would probably admit that if he hasn't already. But yeah, so I guess that's what I would say is I think giving him 1 more year is fine. But I think that in the playoffs next year, there's going to have to be some real improvement from the team. I don't
Well,
think you can get swept, 3 years in a row in the playoffs, and then for a team like ours that's expecting to make significant strides, win a World Series at some point, and then not make any changes.
Well, and that gets into a couple things. One is just like, what is the role of the manager in the modern game of baseball? Obviously, he's not building the roster. We know that. And at the same time, I don't think that Mike Elias is texting him in game to make substitutions. Like there is a middle ground there. what I would imagine is they go over these situations prior to the game, like hypothetical situations. Here's what we would recommend you do. It's on Hyde to do those things in real time, and if he doesn't, then there's a conversation. Now, we don't know if the Orioles have determined, hey, yes, Bobby Witt's really good, but we still advise in this type of situation you pitch to him if you have pitcher X, Y, or Z available to you. I don't know. That's a conversation for them to have. But I think we all know where we stand on how he handled a few things in the postseason. And the other one is just, in terms of how many years he's got left, the Orioles are intentionally vague about contract situations for these coaches. Elias says it's for respect to them, which, hey, that's fine. We get that. So we don't really know what the contract situation is. Did the Orioles offer Brandon Hyde a 1 year extension? Did he already have the 1 year and he's playing out the We don't know. We don't know what the situation is there. So and it's not really any different from when Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter were running the show. I don't think we really knew what their contract situation was. But yeah, anyway, that's the Brandon Hyde take. So
And with managers, the contracts are always somewhat
yeah,
insignificant just because they can be fired at any time. And
sure.
Unless
yeah,
unless you're Craig Counsell.
Which that's a whole thing that I'm sure the Cubs aren't loving that situation at the
Yeah,
moment.
they're ecstatic, right? The Brewers were like 10 million a year. You can go. Yeah,
Yeah, you can go, and we're not going to skip a beat. We're going to trade our
right,
ace, get rid of our manager, and we're still
right.
going to lose in the first round, but you know what? That's fine. But okay, I feel like we covered all the big stuff. We definitely went for a little bit longer than we anticipated, but anything else we should touch on before we wrap it up? No.
I don't know.
Yeah, I
It
mean,
was a disappointing year. Yeah,
yeah.
definitely like tail between legs walking into the off season. And I do think that I, I am morbidly curious to see like how Elias gets creative because I think you need to, I don't know, like we said, you need to do something a little bit new with this team so it doesn't feel like you're just running it back for the third consecutive year. Um, but also we have such a valuable core that, you want to keep it with that to an extent. So
Well, and it's the first off season of the David Rubenstein ownership, and that can be
that's true.
tantalizing too. Like, how many resources are we getting, or are the Orioles getting? You don't want to go overboard too. There can be an over tweaking that, we saw with the Mets a couple years ago. They now less is more for them this year, and that can work out. So we'll see.
I need Gunner at like 16 years, 500 mil. That's what I need,
I mean, they have the Bobby Witt contract. Like, that's
right?
the guidepost because Witt's a year older than Gunner. So now
Right.
a year later, Gunner is that age and you give him the Bobby Witt deal. Like, it
Sounds
is what
great.
it is. Yeah. Oh my. Well, we are gonna have episodes throughout the off season. We're not gonna have three a week or two a week as we were doing throughout the season because there's just not gonna be as much to talk about. But we will continue to have regular episodes. It's not always gonna be all three of us because it's just tough to do. Keep subscribed to us. Subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever you get your audio podcasts on Spotify or elsewhere. Rate and review the show. Give us a positive review that helps us get to other Orioles fans. So we'd really appreciate it. And give us a follow over on X at the Warehouse Pod where Eli does most of the tweeting, the posting, whatever it's called. And I'm gonna try to get on top of the Threads account this year. Just didn't really happen during the summer, but if you're on Threads, go over there at the Warehouse Pod as well. And you can also email the show, thewarehousepod@gmail.com. But I think that's all we've got to plug. It was fun to get together with you guys again for an old school episode. We'll try to do these more often. I said that at the start of the summer and didn't happen at all, but I mean it this time. So we'll try to make it happen.
cool.
But yeah, that is all we've got. So thank you all for listening. This has been the Warehouse Podcast, and my name is Tyler,
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Eli.
and we'll see you next time.